In the heart of a brutal blizzard, a silent plea changed everything. A lonely man and a lynx cub, brought together by the instinct to survive, began a journey no one could have imagined. And what happened next will touch your heart. Subscribe and feel this story with us. Ethan Mitchell had never felt more alone than on that frigid January morning in the vast wilderness of northern Montana. The merciless blizzard had appeared without warning, transforming the familiar forest trails into an unrecognizable white labyrinth. 3 days ago, what should have been a routine trek to photograph wildlife had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The 38-year-old wildlife photographer pulled his worn parka tighter around his body as another violent gust cut through him like invisible blades. His supplies were dwindling dangerously low, and the temperature continued to drop with each passing hour. The wooden cabin he had rented was somewhere to the east, but in this whiteout, east might as well have been another planet. "Just keep moving," Ethan muttered to himself through chattering teeth, his words immediately swallowed by the howling wind. 6 years living in the remote outskirts of Whitefish had taught him that standing still in these conditions meant certain death. As he trudged forward, the weight of his camera equipment feeling heavier with each step, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the isolation he had chosen. After the bitter end of his 10-year marriage to Rebecca, he had fled Chicago's urban chaos, seeking solace in Montana's untamed wilderness. Photography had been his salvation, a way to communicate with the world without actually having to speak to another human being. Now, in the heart of this merciless storm, the irony wasn't lost on him. His self-imposed isolation might be what finished him. Squinting through the swirling snow, Ethan spotted something moving, a small, uneven shadow struggling through the deep drifts. At first, he thought the harsh conditions were causing hallucinations, but as the shape drew closer, he realized it was a lynx kitten, impossibly young to be alone in such weather. The creature's large, moisture-filled eyes locked with his, and Ethan felt an uncomfortable jolt of recognition. The animal couldn't have been more than a few months old, its spotted fur matted with ice and snow. Its delicate paws kept sinking into the deep powder, yet it persisted in following Ethan's tracks. "Get lost!" Ethan shouted over the wind, waving his arms to scare the animal away. "Go find your mother!" The lynx kitten flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a soft, plaintive cry that pierced Ethan more deeply than the cold. He turned away, determined to focus solely on his own survival. People who anthropomorphized wild animals rarely lasted long in these mountains. Ethan pushed on through the blizzard, trying to ignore the persistent sound of the kitten struggling behind him. 1 mile became 2, then 5, and still the baby lynx followed, its movements becoming increasingly labored. At one point, Ethan looked back to see the kitten had collapsed in the snow, its tiny chest heaving with exhaustion. For a moment it didn't move, and Ethan felt an unexpected wave of panic. "Damn it all!" he growled, turning back and trudging toward the fallen animal. When he reached the kitten, Ethan hesitated before removing his glove and gently touching its fur. It was alive but dangerously cold. Something in those wide, trusting eyes broke through the walls he'd so carefully constructed around his heart. With a resigned sigh, Ethan carefully lifted the frail creature and tucked it inside his jacket. The kitten didn't struggle. Instead, it pressed closer to his chest, seeking warmth. "This is temporary," Ethan told it firmly, "just until the storm passes." By nightfall, the blizzard showed no signs of abating. With visibility near zero, Ethan was forced to make an emergency shelter. Finding a cluster of dense pine trees, he used his survival knife to cut branches, creating a crude but effective lean-to against the trunk of the largest tree. He dug out the interior, packing the snow walls tight to provide insulation against the wind. Inside his makeshift shelter, Ethan removed the lynx kitten from his jacket. It was awake now, watching his every move with cautious intensity. He offered it a small piece of jerky from his dwindling supplies, which the kitten sniffed suspiciously before accepting. "That's all you're getting," Ethan said. "I'm not running a charity here." The first night was tense. Ethan kept his distance from the wild animal, knowing that even a kitten could become unpredictable. The lynx likewise remained in the corner of the shelter, eyes reflecting the faint light of Ethan's emergency lamp. But as the temperature plummeted further, Ethan awoke to find the small creature had crept closer, its body trembling violently. Against his better judgment, Ethan allowed the kitten to curl against him. He told himself it was purely practical. They both needed the body heat to survive. Yet as the tiny lynx began to purr softly, something long dormant stirred in Ethan's chest. By morning, the worst of the storm had passed, though heavy snow still fell steadily. Ethan emerged from the shelter to get his bearings and spotted smoke in the distance. Civilization. Relief washed over him, tempered immediately by the realization that he now faced a decision about his unexpected companion. The lynx kitten followed him out of the shelter, shaking snow from its fur. In the daylight, Ethan could see it more clearly. Male, underweight, with no sign of injury, but clearly abandoned or orphaned. The logical thing would be to leave it here, in its natural environment. Wild animals belonged in the wild. "This is where we part ways," Ethan said, gathering his supplies. "You'll be better off with your own kind." He began walking toward the distant smoke, deliberately not looking back. He'd gone perhaps 50 yards when he heard the soft crunch of snow. The kitten was following him, struggling determinedly through the deep drifts. "Go back!" Ethan shouted, stamping his foot. The kitten stopped momentarily, then continued its approach, those penetrating eyes never leaving Ethan's face. 3 times Ethan tried to drive the animal away. 3 times it returned, its persistence outweighing its fear. After the 3rd attempt, Ethan stood still in the vast white landscape, watching the small creature battle through the snow toward him, falling and rising again with stubborn determination. Something in that relentless effort spoke to Ethan on a fundamental level. How many times had he himself fallen? After Rebecca left, after his father's sudden heart attack, after the publishing company rejected his wildlife photography book, each time he had somehow found the strength to keep going. Now, witnessing the same resilience in this tiny wild creature, Ethan felt an unexpected kinship. "Fine," he finally said, bending down as the exhausted kitten reached him, "but just until we find someone who knows what to do with you." The kitten rubbed against his outstretched hand, a sound somewhere between a purr and a chirp emanating from its throat. Ethan carefully picked it up, cradling it against his chest, as he resumed walking toward what he now could see was the small community of Pine Ridge, a logging settlement he'd passed through on his way to the cabin. With each step toward civilization, Ethan told himself this strange connection was temporary. He was not keeping a wild lynx. He was not forming an attachment. He was simply doing the humane thing, helping a creature in need. Nothing more. But as Pine Ridge's wooden buildings came into view, the lynx kitten nestled trustingly against him. Ethan couldn't ignore the warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with physical temperature and everything to do with the unexpected bond forming between 2 lost souls who had found each other in the heart of the storm. What Ethan couldn't possibly know was that this small creature would not only change his life, but would also become the catalyst for healing an entire community fractured by decades of misunderstanding and distrust. The journey that began in a blinding blizzard was about to take him places he'd never imagined possible. The small community of Pine Ridge greeted Ethan with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Word traveled fast in a town of barely 200 people, and many had been concerned when the sudden blizzard hit the region. Sheriff Donna Hayes, a stocky woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and a perpetually worried expression, was the first to spot him trudging into town. "Mitchell, we were about to send a search party," she called out, hurrying toward him. Her expression shifted from relief to confusion when she noticed the small bundle inside his jacket. What in God's name is that? Ethan carefully revealed. The lynx kitten, who was now sleeping soundly against his chest. Found him following me through the storm. Wouldn't leave me alone. A small crowd gathered around them, murmuring in surprise. Pine Ridge was no stranger to wildlife encounters, but no one could recall a wild lynx seeking human company, especially one so young. "That there's a baby bobcat," declared Walter Simmons, the elderly owner of the local general store. "It's a lynx, not a bobcat," Ethan corrected gently. "Look at the ear tufts and the proportions." Donna frowned, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon. "Regardless, it's a wild animal, Ethan. Can't have it in town. It's dangerous." "He's just a kitten," Ethan protested, surprised by his own defensiveness. "He'll die out there alone." "That's nature's way," Walter said with a shrug. "Circle of life and all that." The kitten chose that moment to wake, lifting its head and blinking slowly at the gathered crowd. A collective awe rippled through the onlookers, momentarily softening their concerns. Meredith Cooper, the town's veterinarian who primarily treated farm animals and pets, pushed her way through the crowd. "Let me see him," she said, her tone professional, but her eyes revealing keen interest. Ethan hesitated before carefully transferring the kitten to Meredith's waiting hands. The lynx immediately tensed, a low growl rumbling from its throat. "Easy." "There, little one," Meredith murmured, her experienced fingers gently examining the animal. "Male, probably 3 to 4 months old, underweight but no obvious injuries." She looked up at Ethan. "Where's the mother?" "No sign of her," Ethan replied. "He followed me for nearly 10 miles through the storm." Meredith frowned thoughtfully. "That's unusual behavior for a lynx. They're solitary animals, especially with humans." She returned the increasingly agitated kitten to Ethan, and immediately the animal calmed, nestling back against his chest. "Well, I'll be," Walter muttered. "Things imprinted on you, Mitchell." Sheriff Donna crossed her arms. "Regardless, we can't have a wild predator in town. There are regulations. I'll contact Fish and Wildlife in the morning." "And until then?" Ethan asked, surprising himself again with how protective he suddenly felt. "He can stay at my clinic overnight," Meredith offered. "I've got a secure enclosure." The lynx kitten, sensing their intentions, pressed closer to Ethan, his claws digging slightly into the material of his jacket. The gesture wasn't threatening but desperate, a plea not to be separated from the human who had saved him. "I'll keep him with me," Ethan said firmly. "Just for tonight. I'm staying at the Silver Pine Motel anyway." Donna looked like she wanted to object, but merely sighed. "Your funeral, Mitchell, just keep it contained, and don't come crying to me if you wake up missing an eye." The crowd gradually dispersed, though not without curious glances back at the odd pair. As Ethan made his way to the town's only motel, Meredith fell into step beside him. "He should really have a proper examination," she said. "And some specialized food. Regular cat food won't do for a lynx." Ethan nodded, grateful for her practical approach. "I'll bring him by your clinic tomorrow morning." Meredith gave him a sidelong glance. "You know they'll take him away, right? Fish and Wildlife will place him in a rehabilitation center at best." The thought created an uncomfortable tightness in Ethan's chest, but he nodded. "It's for the best. He belongs in the wild." "Does he?" Meredith asked softly. Then with a small smile, she turned toward her clinic. "See you tomorrow, Ethan." That night in the modest motel room, Ethan created a makeshift bed for the lynx using spare towels. The kitten explored the new environment, cautiously sniffing every corner before returning to Ethan's side, clearly still uncertain about their strange new surroundings. "You need a name," Ethan said, surprising himself. Naming the animal went against every principle of wildlife photography he'd adopted over the years. Never personify, never interfere, always observe from a distance. Yet here he was, contemplating names for a wild lynx. The kitten looked up at him with those penetrating amber eyes, and Ethan was struck by the intelligence and awareness they held. Tracker, he decided, since you tracked me through that storm. If approving of his new name, Tracker chirped softly and settled onto Ethan's lap, immediately beginning to purr. The sound filled the quiet room, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the sharp edges of his loneliness begin to soften. Morning came with a knock on the door. Ethan opened it to find Meredith holding a small cooler and a pet carrier. "Brought some proper food," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Where's our little survivor?" Tracker was perched on the windowsill watching the early morning activities of the town with apparent fascination. He turned at Meredith's entrance, his body language immediately becoming guarded. "He's still wary of strangers," Ethan explained. Meredith set down her supplies. "That's actually a good sign. He shouldn't be too comfortable around humans if there's any hope of releasing him back into the wild." She opened the cooler, revealing several containers. Raw game meat, some supplements, and formula designed for orphaned wild felines. "My cousin works at a wildlife sanctuary in Idaho. She gave me these recommendations over the phone last night." Ethan was touched by her thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." Meredith shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "Professional interest, that's all." She hesitated before adding, "Besides, it's not every day someone walks into Pine Ridge with a lynx kitten tucked in their jacket." Under Meredith's guidance, Ethan offered Tracker a small portion of the raw meat. The kitten approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, then began to eat with obvious hunger. Watching him, Ethan felt an inexplicable sense of pride. "Fish and Wildlife will be here this afternoon," Meredith said quietly, disrupting the moment. "Donna called them first thing." Ethan nodded, having expected as much. "It's the right thing to do." "Is it?" Meredith asked, watching Tracker. "I've been thinking about this all night. Lynx kittens usually stay with their mothers for up to 10 months, learning to hunt and survive. At his age, released alone, his chances aren't good." "What are you suggesting?" Ethan asked, though he already sensed where she was heading. "There's a wildlife sanctuary about 100 miles from here, Wilderness Heart. They rehabilitate orphaned predators with the goal of eventual release. But they also have a program where certain animals deemed unreleasable become ambassador animals for education." Hope flickered in Ethan's chest, though he tried to suppress it. "And you think Tracker might qualify?" Meredith smiled. "You named him already. That's never a good sign for objectivity." Ethan felt his cheeks warm. "It just sort of happened." "Look," Meredith said, turning serious, "I can make some calls. The sanctuary director, Julia Blackwood, is an old college friend. But Ethan, even if Tracker goes there, you'd have to be prepared to let him go. These aren't pets." "I know that," Ethan said firmly. "I just want what's best for him." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock, more of a pounding. "Really?" Sheriff Donna stood at the door, accompanied by a stern-looking man in a fish and wildlife uniform. "Richard Trent," the man introduced himself. "Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I understand you've taken possession of a protected species, Mr. Mitchell." Tracker, sensing the tension, retreated under the bed, his eyes gleaming warily from the shadows. "He was orphaned in the storm," Ethan explained. "I was just trying to help him survive." "Commendable," Trent said without warmth, "but illegal without proper permits. I'll be taking the animal to our regional facility for assessment." "Wait," Meredith interjected. "I've been in contact with Wilderness Heart Sanctuary. They've expressed interest in taking him for their rehabilitation program." Trent frowned. "Wilderness Heart? They've got a waiting list a mile long." "The director is a personal friend," Meredith pressed. "They're willing to make room for this." "In case," Trent's expression remained skeptical. "Even so, there are protocols." which can be expedited with your recommendation, Meredith interrupted smoothly. You know Julia runs one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in the Northwest. A tense silence filled the room as Trent considered. Finally, he sighed. I'll need to examine the animal first, and there's paperwork, lots of it. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of paperwork, examinations, and tense negotiations. Richard Trent proved to be thorough to the point of obsession, insisting on a complete medical workup for Tracker before even considering the sanctuary option. Through it all, Ethan remained by the Lynx kitten's side, becoming increasingly attached, despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance. Meredith's veterinary clinic became their temporary headquarters. Its small examination room transformed into an impromptu wildlife assessment center. Tracker tolerated the examinations only when Ethan was present, growing aggressive whenever strangers approached without his human protector nearby. This level of attachment is concerning, Trent remarked on the second day, reviewing his notes with a frown. It significantly decreases his chances for successful reintroduction to the wild. Or it makes him a perfect candidate for the ambassador program, Meredith countered, not looking up from the blood sample she was processing. Over the past 2 days, she'd become Tracker's second most tolerated human, a fact that gave Ethan an unexpected sense of satisfaction. Trent's cell phone rang, and he stepped outside to take the call. The moment he left, Tracker visibly relaxed, moving from his defensive position in the corner to rub against Ethan's legs. "You're not helping your case, buddy," Ethan murmured, reaching down to scratch behind the lynx's ears. The kitten responded with a purr that seemed impossibly loud for his size. Meredith glanced up from her microscope, a small smile playing at her lips. "You know, for someone who spent years photographing wildlife without interfering, you've made quite the exception here." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with how accurately she'd assessed the situation. "He didn't give me much choice. Stubborn little guy." "Reminds me of someone else I know," Meredith teased, her blue eyes twinkling. In the short time they'd spent working together to help Tracker, Ethan had come to appreciate not only her professional expertise, but her dry humor and straightforward manner. Trent returned, his perpetual frown deeper than before. "That was Julia Blackwood from Wilderness Heart," he announced. "They've agreed to assess the lynx for their program, but there's a condition." "What kind of condition?" Ethan asked warily. "You," Trent said, pointing at Ethan. "Ms. Blackwood insists that since the animal is bonded with you, you'll need to participate in the transition process. It could take weeks, possibly months." Ethan blinked in surprise. "I have a job, responsibilities." "Wildlife photography, right?" Meredith interjected. "Couldn't you consider this a special assignment? Document Tracker's journey." The idea took root immediately in Ethan's mind. Not only would it give him a legitimate reason to stay involved in Tracker's life, but it could also become a compelling photo essay. Perhaps even the foundation for the book project he'd abandoned after the publishing rejection. "I'd need to extend my stay in the area," Ethan said slowly, thinking it through. "Get a more permanent place than the motel." "The old Carson cabin is available for rent," Meredith suggested. "It's just outside town at the edge of the national forest. Might suit your needs." Trent cleared his throat impatiently. "So you'll do it? Because if not, I need to transport this animal to our facility today." Ethan looked down at Tracker, who stared back with those penetrating amber eyes that somehow seemed to understand everything happening around him. The decision, Ethan realized, had actually been made days ago, in the heart of the blizzard, when he'd first tucked the freezing kitten inside his jacket. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "When do we leave for the sanctuary?" 2 days later, Ethan found himself driving his weathered Jeep along a winding mountain road, following Trent's government vehicle toward Wilderness Heart Sanctuary. In a specially designed carrier in the passenger seat, Tracker watched the passing landscape with alert interest. "Almost there, buddy," Ethan said, surprised by the nervous flutter in his stomach. Despite Meredith's assurances about her friend Julia, he couldn't help worrying about Tracker's future. What if the Sanctuary deemed him unsuitable for their programs? What if they insisted on immediate separation? The Sanctuary itself was nothing like Ethan had imagined. Instead of the institutional facility he'd expected, Wilderness Heart sprawled across a picturesque valley nestled between two mountain ranges. The complex included several rustic buildings surrounded by large, naturalistic enclosures designed to mimic the animals' native habitats. Julia Blackwood met them at the main gate, a tall, athletic woman in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Ethan of Meredith. Her handshake was firm, her assessment of both Ethan and Tracker swift and thorough. "Meredith speaks highly of you," she said, leading them toward the main building. "And she wasn't exaggerating about this little guy's attachment to you." "Will that be a problem?" Ethan asked. Julia considered the question as they walked. "It's unusual, certainly. Our goal is typically to minimize human attachment for animals intended for release. However, for ambassador animals, a comfortable relationship with humans can be beneficial, within appropriate boundaries, of course." The main building housed administrative offices, veterinary facilities, and temporary housing for animals undergoing assessment. Tracker's new quarters were spacious and thoughtfully designed with platforms, hiding places, and climbing opportunities. "We'll start with a 2-week assessment period," Julia explained as they settled Tracker into the space. "During this time, we'll evaluate his physical health, behavior, and responses to various stimuli. You're welcome to visit daily, Mr. Mitchell, but we'll gradually reduce your time with him to see how he adjusts." The thought of separation created an unexpected tightness in Ethan's chest, but he nodded in agreement. "I understand, and please, call me Ethan." Julia smiled, her professional reserve softening slightly. "Ethan, then. Meredith mentioned you're a wildlife photographer." "That's right. We're always in need of quality images for our educational materials and fundraising efforts. Perhaps you might be interested in documenting more than just Tracker's journey while you're here." The offer was clearly an olive branch, a way to keep him involved with the Sanctuary beyond his connection to Tracker. Ethan found himself genuinely appreciative of her thoughtfulness. "I'd be honored," he replied honestly. As they left Tracker to explore his new surroundings, Julia introduced Ethan to the Sanctuary's other residents: wolves recovering from illegal trapping, orphaned bear cubs learning to forage, a one-winged golden eagle that served as the Sanctuary's most prominent ambassador animal. "Each animal here has a story," Julia explained as they walked. "Many are victims of human encroachment or illegal activities. Others, like your lynx, simply found themselves in circumstances where human intervention became necessary for their survival." "Tracker," Ethan corrected automatically. "His name is Tracker." Julia raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on the naming of a wild animal, a practice usually discouraged for those intended for release. Instead, she continued the tour, explaining the Sanctuary's philosophy and methodologies. By the time Ethan left that evening, he felt cautiously optimistic about Tracker's future. The Sanctuary seemed to offer the perfect balance, a safe environment where the young lynx could develop his natural instincts while still maintaining the connection that had formed between them in the blizzard. The Carson cabin proved to be an ideal base for Ethan's extended stay. Situated at the edge of the forest with a spectacular view of the mountains, it offered both solitude for his work and reasonable proximity to both Pine Ridge and the Sanctuary. The owner, an elderly widow now living with her daughter in Missoula, was delighted to have a long-term tenant for the winter season. Each morning, Ethan rose before dawn, capturing the first light on the snow-covered landscape before making the drive to Wilderness Heart. His days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings with Tracker, afternoons photographing the Sanctuary's other residents, evenings processing images in the cabin's rustic living room. To his surprise, Meredith frequently made the drive from Pine Ridge to the sanctuary, ostensibly to consult with Julia on various cases, but always finding time to check on Tracker's progress. Her visits became a highlight of Ethan's week, their professional discussions about wildlife rehabilitation gradually expanding to include more personal conversations. 2 weeks stretched into a month. Tracker grew stronger, his thin frame filling out with proper nutrition. The sanctuary staff began introducing him to training exercises designed to develop his natural hunting instincts, while also acclimating him to controlled human interaction. "He's thriving," Julia told Ethan one afternoon as they watched Tracker successfully stalk and pounce on a mechanical prey item designed to mimic a snowshoe hare. "But I have concerns about his ultimate release potential." Ethan had been expecting this conversation. He'd seen how Tracker continued to seek human interaction, particularly with him, while the young lynx was developing appropriate predatory behaviors. He showed none of the wariness of humans that would be essential for survival in the wild. "What are the options?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the hope blooming in his chest. "Typically, for an animal in his situation, we'd consider him for our ambassador program," Julia explained. "He would remain at the sanctuary in a naturalistic but controlled environment, participating in educational programs and helping visitors understand the importance of wildlife conservation." And would I still be able to visit him?" The question slipped out before Ethan could stop himself. Julia smiled knowingly. "Yes, though we'd want to establish a routine that prioritizes his needs and development. The bond between you is unusual, Ethan. In my 20 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've rarely seen anything quite like it, especially with a naturally solitary species like the lynx." Before their conversation could continue, an alarm sounded from the main building. Julia's expression immediately shifted to concern. "That's the weather alert," she said, already moving toward the sound. "We've been monitoring a major storm system." Ethan followed her to the administrative office, where staff members were gathered around a weather radar display. The approaching storm glowed an ominous red and purple on the screen. "It's shifting south," one of the technicians was saying, "projected to hit us directly within 12 hours. They're calling it the worst blizzard in a decade." Julia's face was grim as she turned to her team. "Initiate emergency protocols. I want all outdoor enclosures reinforced and extra supplies distributed to all sections. Call in everyone on the backup staff roster." The room erupted into organized chaos as staff members dispersed to their assigned tasks. Julia turned to Ethan. "You should head back to the cabin now, while the roads are still passable," she said. "We've got generators and supplies to weather this out." "What about Tracker?" Ethan asked. "He'll be secure in the assessment center," Julia assured him. "It's our newest building, designed to withstand extreme conditions." Ethan nodded reluctantly. "Is there anything I can do to help before I go?" Julia considered for a moment. "Actually, yes. We need to document the state of the enclosures before the storm hits for insurance and grant requirements. Your photography skills would be perfect for this." For the next 2 hours, Ethan worked alongside the sanctuary staff, photographing enclosures and helping secure loose equipment. The sky darkened prematurely as the storm front approached, the wind already beginning to gust with concerning force. "That's the last one," Ethan told Julia, showing her the final images on his camera's display. "I should probably head out now before it gets worse." Julia nodded, her expression troubled as she looked at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. "Drive carefully. This storm looks serious." As Ethan made his final visit to Tracker before leaving, he couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The young lynx seemed agitated, pacing his enclosure and vocalizing in a way Ethan hadn't heard before. "It's okay, buddy," Ethan said softly through the viewing panel. "You'll be safe here." Tracker stopped his pacing to stare at Ethan, those amber eyes somehow communicating more than words ever could. For a moment, Ethan was transported back to their first meeting in the blizzard, that initial connection that had defied explanation. The memory sent a chill down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. As he reluctantly turned to leave, he couldn't escape the feeling that their journey together was far from over, that the approaching storm would test not only the sanctuary's preparations, but the bond that had formed between a solitary man and a wild creature in the heart of winter's fury. The blizzard hit with a vengeance that surpassed even the direst predictions. By the time Ethan reached the Carson cabin, visibility had dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled with such ferocity that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the sturdy structure. He barely managed to bring in extra firewood before the full force of the storm made stepping outside impossible. The electricity flickered once, twice, then surrendered completely to the storm's fury, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the orange glow of the fireplace. Ethan lit kerosene lamps and stoked the fire higher, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the growing unease that had settled in his chest like a cold stone. Throughout the night, Ethan's thoughts kept returning to Tracker. Despite Julia's assurances about the sanctuary's preparedness, he couldn't shake his concern. The persistent image of the lynx's agitated behavior before he left haunted him, making sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Tracker pacing nervously, those amber eyes filled with what he now recognized as a premonition of danger. Outside, the storm roared like a living entity, a white beast intent on devouring everything in its path. Trees groaned under the weight of accumulating snow, their boughs occasionally snapping with cracks that sounded like gunshots through the cacophony of wind. Ethan checked his phone repeatedly, but the signal bars had disappeared entirely, leaving him isolated in a cocoon of growing worry. He tried to rationalize his anxiety. The sanctuary was a professional facility with emergency protocols and generators. Julia and her team were experienced wildlife handlers who had weathered many Montana winters, yet the unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour until it became a physical ache in his chest. At dawn, though the storm's darkness made it nearly indistinguishable from night, Ethan's cell phone suddenly chirped to life, showing a single bar of signal. Almost immediately it rang. The connection was weak, the voice on the other end breaking up, but he recognized Julia's urgent tone immediately. "Ethan, Emergency Assessment Center, structural damage." His heart plummeted. "Julia? What about Tracker? Is he okay?" "Don't know. Evacuated most animals. Tracker's enclosure, inaccessible, collapsed section." The call dropped before Ethan could respond. He stared at the phone in horror, the implications of Julia's fragmented message sinking in. The assessment center was damaged. Tracker might be trapped, injured, or worse. Without conscious thought, Ethan was moving, pulling on his heaviest winter gear, gathering emergency supplies in his backpack. The rational part of his mind told him this was madness. Attempting to reach the sanctuary in these conditions could be suicidal. But a stronger impulse drove him forward. Tracker had trusted him, had followed him through a blizzard just months ago. He couldn't abandon the Lynx now, not when he might be trapped and frightened. In the entryway, Ethan caught his reflection. In the small mirror by the door, a man he barely recognized, eyes wild with determination, face set in grim resolve. This wasn't just about an animal anymore. It was about honoring a connection that had fundamentally changed him, that had begun to heal wounds he'd carried for years. The 15-mile drive to Wilderness Heart, normally a peaceful journey through spectacular mountain scenery, became a harrowing test of will and skill. The Jeep's headlights barely penetrated the swirling wall of white that surrounded him. Twice, Ethan nearly slid off the road entirely, the vehicle's four-wheel drive barely maintaining traction on the ice-slicked surface. Drifts had already accumulated to dangerous heights, forcing him to navigate almost blindly through a white labyrinth. "Just a little further," he muttered to himself, knuckles white on the steering wheel as he fought to keep the jeep on what he hoped was still the road. When the path became completely impassable, about 3 miles from the sanctuary, Ethan abandoned the vehicle without hesitation. Strapping on snowshoes and securing his emergency pack, he pushed forward into the storm. Each step required monumental effort against the driving wind and deep snow. His face burned from the cold despite being mostly covered, and his lungs ached with each labored breath. "Hold on, tracker," he repeated like a mantra, the words immediately whipped away by the howling gale. "I'm coming." The landscape had transformed into an alien wasteland, familiar landmarks obliterated under mountains of snow. Without the GPS on his phone, Ethan would have been completely disoriented. Even with technological guidance, the journey seemed impossible, a foolhardy mission that any sane person would have abandoned. An hour into the trek, exhaustion began to take its toll. Ethan's muscles screamed in protest with each step, and his extremities were growing dangerously numb despite his insulated gear. When he stumbled and fell face first into a drift, the cold snow shocking against his skin, a moment of clarity cut through his single-minded determination. He could die out here, just as easily as he had nearly died in the first blizzard before. Finding the cabin. The irony wasn't lost on him, risking his life now for the creature who had once followed him through similar conditions. But unlike Tracker, who had been driven by instinct and desperation, Ethan was making a conscious choice, one that defied logic but felt irrefutably right in his soul. Forcing himself back to his feet, Ethan paused long enough to extract an energy bar from his pack, wolfing it down despite having no appetite. The calories would help keep his core temperature up, and he would need every ounce of strength for what lay ahead. Nearly 2 hours after leaving his jeep, exhausted and half-frozen, Ethan finally glimpsed the sanctuary's main gate through the swirling white. The scene that greeted him was one of organized chaos. Staff members battling the elements as they moved animals from damaged structures to secure facilities, emergency vehicles with chains on their tires struggling to navigate the property. Julia spotted him first, her expression shifting from shock to anger as she rushed toward him, fighting against the wind. "Ethan, what the hell are you doing here? It's not safe." "Got your call," he shouted over the wind, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Where's Tracker?" Julia's face fell, her features tightening with worry. "We still haven't reached his section. Part of the roof collapsed over the northeast corridor. The structural engineers won't let us go in. They say the whole wing could come down at any minute." "You're still trying, though, right?" Ethan pressed, desperation edging into his voice. "Of course we are," Julia said, looking offended at the suggestion. "We've been working on clearing a path from the eastern entrance, but it's slow going. The debris is unstable, and with this weather..." Ethan didn't wait for her to finish. Moving with renewed purpose, he headed toward the assessment center, ignoring Julia's shouts behind him. The cold that had numbed his limbs seemed to recede, replaced by a burning determination that warmed him from within. The damage was worse than he'd imagined. The assessment center's eastern wing had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, creating a treacherous maze of broken beams and debris. 2 staff members in hard hats and safety gear were attempting to clear a path through the wreckage, but their progress was painfully slow. "You can't go in there," Julia said, catching up to him and grabbing his arm. "The structural integrity is compromised. It could come down completely any minute." "Then we need to work faster," Ethan replied, already moving to help the workers. "Where exactly is Tracker's enclosure?" One of the workers, a young man named Carlos, whom Ethan recognized from his previous visits, pointed toward a section still obscured by debris. "Past that fallen support beam. We've been trying to reach it for the past hour, but every time we clear something, more snow and ice come down." Studying the situation, Ethan spotted a narrow opening between two collapsed beams barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Without the bulky equipment the workers were using, he might be able to maneuver through the gap and reach the corridor beyond. "I can fit through there," he said, already removing his heaviest outer gear. "Absolutely not," Julia protested, stepping in front of him. "It's too dangerous. I can't authorize this." Ethan looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking for authorization, Julia. I'm going in there, with or without your blessing." "You could be killed. And if it were Max," Ethan countered, referencing the sanctuary's oldest resident wolf, to whom Julia was particularly attached. "Would you stand out here and do nothing?" The question hit its mark. Julia's expression softened slightly, understanding replacing some of the anger in her eyes. "At least take this," she said finally, removing her hard hat and radio. "And promise me you'll turn back at the first sign of further collapse." Ethan nodded, though they both knew it was a promise he might not keep. Securing the hard hat and radio, he approached the narrow opening. Behind him, he heard Julia instructing the workers to continue their efforts from the outside, providing backup for his unorthodox rescue attempt. The passage was tighter than it had appeared from outside. Ethan was forced to drop to his knees and then to his stomach, wriggling through the constricted space like a spelunker navigating a cave system. The hard hat scraped against fallen beams. Above, sending cascades of dust and small debris raining down on him. Something caught his jacket, tearing the material and scraping his skin beneath, but he pushed on. The cold that had plagued him during his trek to the sanctuary was now replaced by claustrophobic heat as he struggled through the tight passage, sweat stinging his eyes despite the freezing temperatures. The passage finally opened into a dark corridor, partially blocked but navigable. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the damaged interior. Broken water pipes had leaked before freezing, creating surreal ice formations along the walls and floor, reflecting the dim light in ghostly patterns. Ethan moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The building groaned around him, shifting in the wind, each creak and crack sending spikes of adrenaline through his system. "Tracker!" he called out. "Where are you, buddy?" The silence that answered sent a new wave of fear through him. Moving faster now, Ethan navigated around fallen ceiling panels and broken fixtures, remembering the layout from his many visits over the past months. The animal enclosures were arranged in a horseshoe pattern, with Tracker's habitat positioned at the far curve of the design. As he proceeded deeper into the damaged structure, the devastation increased. Entire sections of ceiling had given way, allowing snow to pile inside the building. The temperature dropped noticeably where the building's envelope had been breached, the howling of the wind now audible through the gaps in the structure. Finally, Ethan reached the area where Tracker's enclosure should have been. The sight that greeted him made his breath catch painfully in his throat. The ceiling had completely given way here, burying everything under a mountain of snow, ice, and structural debris. The specialized habitat that had been designed for Tracker's comfort and enrichment was now unrecognizable beneath the destruction. For a terrible moment, Ethan thought he was too late. Standing in the devastation, surrounded by the groaning of compromised structural elements, he felt a crushing weight of failure. Then he heard it, a faint whimpering sound coming from beneath the rubble. The sound was so quiet he might have missed it if he'd been calling out at that moment. Following the noise, Ethan began digging frantically, tossing aside chunks of ice and splintered wood with bare hands, now bleeding from countless small cuts. The radio at his belt crackled with Julia's voice asking for an update, but he ignored it, focused entirely on reaching the source of the sound. "I'm coming, Tracker! Hold on!" After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, his efforts revealed a small pocket protected by two fallen beams that had fortuitously formed a triangular safe space. And there, curled into a tight ball with eyes wide with fear, was Tracker. The young lynx was nearly unrecognizable at first. His normally immaculate fur was matted with dust and debris, his proud posture reduced to a trembling crouch. But when he saw Ethan, his entire demeanor transformed. He let out a sound somewhere between a chirp and a cry, immediately trying to move toward his human friend. It was then that Ethan noticed with alarm that one of Tracker's hind legs was pinned beneath a piece of debris, a section of metal, shelving that had fallen across the small sanctuary created by the crossed beams. "Easy, buddy," Ethan soothed carefully. Assessing the situation, the debris didn't appear to be crushing the leg, merely trapping it. With gentle, deliberate movements, he shifted the piece, freeing Tracker's limb. The young lynx immediately launched himself into Ethan's arms, trembling violently. For an animal normally so dignified and independent, this display of vulnerability spoke volumes about the terror he must have endured. His claws dug into Ethan's jacket as he pressed his face against the human's chest, his entire body shaking with relief and residual fear. "I've got you," Ethan murmured, cradling the lynx against his chest, just as he had during their first meeting in the blizzard. "We're going to get out of here. You're safe now." The radio at his belt crackled again, more insistently this time. With one hand still supporting Tracker, Ethan managed to respond, informing Julia that he had found Tracker alive. "Get out of there now," came her immediate reply. "The engineers are saying the structure is shifting more rapidly. You've got maybe 10 minutes before secondary collapse." "On my way," Ethan confirmed, already mentally planning his retreat path. The return journey proved even more difficult than the approach. Tracker refused to be separated from Ethan, clinging to him with a desperation that made navigating the tight spaces nearly impossible. Each time Ethan tried to shift the lynx to a more manageable position, Tracker's grip would tighten, his whole body tensing with renewed fear. Okay, Ethan soothed. "We'll do this your way." The narrow passage that had been difficult to navigate alone became a supreme challenge with a frightened lynx attached to his chest. Ethan was forced to turn sideways, inching along with excruciating slowness, all while the building continued to groan ominously around them. At one particularly tight section, Ethan found himself completely stuck, unable to move forward or backward. Panic flared briefly, before he forced it down, knowing that losing composure now could be fatal for both of them. With careful, controlled movements, he managed to shift his position just enough to create the extra inch of clearance needed to continue. By the time they emerged from the collapsed section, Ethan's clothes were torn, his body covered in scrapes and bruises, and his muscles trembling from exertion. Julia and her team were waiting with expressions of disbelief that quickly transformed to relief when they saw both man and lynx alive. "You crazy, reckless," Julia started, then stopped when she saw Tracker's condition. "Is he injured?" "His leg was trapped, but I don't think it's broken," Ethan replied, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "He needs to be checked out." As if on cue, the building behind them emitted a terrifying groan, followed by a series of sharp cracks. Everyone instinctively backed away as another section of the roof gave way, crashing down precisely where Ethan had been just minutes before. The reality of how close they had come to disaster hit home, sending a delayed wave of shock through Ethan's system. In the sanctuary's makeshift emergency medical area, a heated tent set up near the main building, Meredith Cooper waited with supplies ready. Her presence surprised Ethan. She was supposed to be in Pine Ridge, safely away from the danger zone. "When Julia couldn't reach you after the call dropped, she called me," Meredith explained, already examining Tracker with gentle efficiency. "I figured you'd do something stupidly heroic, so I thought someone should be here to patch you both up afterward." Despite Ethan's attempts to set Tracker down on the examination table, the lynx refused to release his grip on Ethan's jacket. Meredith worked around this, her experienced hands gently probing the young animal's limbs and body for injuries. "You're going to have to hold him while I check that leg," she instructed. "Talk to him. Keep him calm." Ethan cradled Tracker's head against his shoulder, murmuring a continuous stream of reassurances as Meredith carefully manipulated the previously trapped limb. Tracker flinched but didn't struggle, his trust in Ethan evidently extending to those Ethan himself trusted. "Remarkably, he seems mostly unharmed," Meredith announced finally, straightening up with an expression of relief. "Some bruising on the hind leg that was trapped, minor cuts and scrapes, but nothing broken or severely damaged. He's one lucky cat." "What about you?" she asked, turning her attention to Ethan. "Those hands need attention." Ethan looked down, surprised to see his hands covered in cuts and scrapes, some still seeping blood. In the adrenaline of the rescue, he hadn't even felt the pain. Now, as the adrenaline began to subside, the stinging became noticeable, along with various other aches and pains from his ordeal. As Meredith cleaned and bandaged his injuries, the full weight of the day's events began to settle on Ethan. The exhaustion, the fear, the desperate race against time, it all crashed over him in a wave that left him lightheaded and unexpectedly emotional. "Hey," Meredith said softly, her hand steady on his arm. "You did good today. Really good. Not many people would have risked what you did." Her simple words broke something loose inside him. For the first time since his divorce, since walking away from his life in Chicago, Ethan felt tears burning behind his eyes, not from pain or sadness, but from a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. "I couldn't leave him there," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything." Meredith's expression softened with understanding. "I know. That's what makes you who you are, Ethan Mitchell." Julia joined them, her earlier anger now replaced with reluctant admiration. "The storm's intensity is finally decreasing," she reported. "Emergency services should be able to reach us by tomorrow morning. We've managed to secure all the animals, though we've got significant structural damage to deal with." She looked at Tracker, still clinging to Ethan as if his life depended on it. "I think this resolves any questions about his suitability for release," she said with a wry smile. "No wild lynx would maintain this level of human attachment, especially after trauma." "What happens now?" Ethan asked, unconsciously tightening his hold on Tracker. Julia and Meredith exchanged a meaningful glance that suggested they had already discussed this very question. "I've been thinking about that," Julia said slowly. "What you did today was incredibly reckless, Ethan. You could have been killed." "I'd do it again," he replied without hesitation. "I know. That's what worries me." Julia sighed, then continued. "But it also demonstrates something rather extraordinary. The bond between you and Tracker isn't just unusual. It's exceptional. In all my years working with wildlife, I've never seen anything quite like it." "What are you suggesting?" Ethan asked, a fragile hope beginning to form in his chest. "We have a program, rarely implemented, highly selective, for certain ambassador animals. In special circumstances, we place them with trained wildlife guardians who work directly with the sanctuary as educational partners. The animal remains under our legal purview, but lives with their guardian, participating in controlled educational programs." The implication of her words stunned Ethan into momentary silence. "You'd need specialized training," Julia continued. "There would be strict protocols, regular evaluations, and you'd need to commit to the educational mission of the sanctuary. It's not ownership, it's stewardship." "Are you saying," Ethan couldn't finish the sentence, afraid to voice the possibility lest it somehow vanish before it could become reality. "I'm saying we should consider it," Julia replied carefully. "It would be unprecedented for a lynx, but then again, everything about your relationship with Tracker has been unprecedented from the start." Meredith spoke up. "The Carson cabin would need modifications, a secure outdoor enclosure, proper facilities. But it's ideally situated, with the forest right there for controlled exploration. You've already discussed this, Ethan realized, looking between the two women. Theoretically, Meredith admitted with a small smile. After watching you two together these past weeks, it seemed like a possibility worth exploring. Today's events just confirmed what we were already thinking. Tracker, as if sensing the momentous conversation happening around him, finally relaxed his grip on Ethan's jacket. He settled more comfortably in Ethan's lap, his purr rumbling softly, as he regarded the humans with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than any wild animal should. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of destruction yet filled with new possibilities, Ethan felt a shift within himself, a final healing of the isolation he had chosen after his divorce, a reconnection not just with Tracker, but with the community that had formed around them both. 3 months later, on a crisp spring morning, Ethan stood on the porch of the Carson cabin, now his permanent home, watching Tracker explore the spacious enclosure that extended from the house into the edge of the forest. The young lynx had grown considerably, his gangly adolescent form filling out into the powerful build of a maturing predator. His spotted coat gleamed with health in the morning sunlight as he practiced pouncing on a specially designed enrichment toy. The sanctuary's Wildlife Guardian program had turned out to be even more rewarding than Ethan had anticipated. Twice weekly, he and Tracker visited schools, community centers, and environmental events, educating people about lynx conservation and the delicate balance of Montana's ecosystem. Ethan's photographs, documenting their unique journey, together had caught the attention of a prestigious wildlife magazine, leading to a regular column and the book deal that had once seemed an impossible dream. The sound of tires on gravel announced Meredith's arrival. She visited regularly, both in her professional capacity to check on Tracker's health and increasingly for reasons that had nothing to do with veterinary care. The friendship that had formed during the crisis had deepened into something more, a slow-blooming relationship that Ethan was still learning to navigate after years of solitude. "How's our celebrity cat today?" Meredith asked as she joined him on the porch, her shoulder brushing comfortably against his. "Practicing his hunting skills," Ethan replied, nodding toward Tracker, who had abandoned his toy to watch a real squirrel chattering angrily from a safe perch in a nearby pine tree. "We've got the school visit in Whitefish tomorrow," Meredith reminded him. "Julia says they're expecting over 100 kids." "He'll charm them all," Ethan said confidently. "He always does." Tracker, seemingly aware of being discussed, turned to look at them. For a moment, he stared directly at Ethan with those penetrating, ember eyes that had first connected with his during a desperate blizzard. Then, with the dignified grace that was becoming his hallmark, the lynx approached the edge of the enclosure closest to the porch, settling there in silent communion with his human companion. Looking at Tracker, then at Meredith beside him, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The path that had led him here had been unexpected, fraught with challenges and occasional danger. Yet following it had brought him not only a unique partnership with a remarkable wild creature, but also a return to the human connections he'd once fled. "I never thought I'd say this," Ethan admitted quietly, "but I'm grateful for that blizzard." Meredith's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "Sometimes we find our way only after getting completely lost." As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the Montana landscape, Ethan reflected on the silent plea he'd recognized in Tracker's eyes during that first encounter, and how answering it had ultimately saved them both. A wild lynx and a solitary man, each wounded in their own way, had somehow found in each other exactly what they needed to heal. The weather forecast called for clear skies for weeks to come, But Ethan knew that whatever storms might appear on the horizon, literal or metaphorical, he would no longer face them alone. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and Tracker's remarkable journey has touched your hearts. The silent bond formed in a blinding blizzard, growing against all odds into something extraordinary, reminds us that connections can form in the most unexpected places. For more emotionally captivating stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist that explores similar themes of healing and unlikely friendships. Find it by clicking on the left of your screen. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexities and unexpected beauty. Don't miss our upcoming content. We have many more stories waiting to be told.